Our next session will be moderated by Kelly McGuire. Kelly is an economist in the National Center for Environmental Economics at EPA who's been working on equity issues in terms of the EPA-wide guidance. So welcome.
Hi, thank you. I'm looking forward to this session. I've been working on equity issues and distributional issues for about 10 years at EPA on sort of a low burn. And in the last 6 months, we've really turned up the heat on that. I practically spend most of my time thinking about how to incorporate equity into our regulatory impact analyses. And one of the issues is that we don't have consistent ways in which we might do this. And those tools for doing equity analysis aren't as well developed as we have for benefit cost analysis. And so this panel is going to be very informative to me and to us as a group in presenting different ways in which we might think about incorporating equity into our regulatory analyses. So our first presentation is from Don Fullerton from the University of Illinois.
Thank you, Kelly. Is someone else going to put my slides up there? You are, okay. There we go. So, I guess most of the panel will be talking about how to incorporate distributional effects into cost-benefit measures or how to use distributional weights in a social welfare function. I'm not going to talk about that so much, but about the problem of measuring those distributional effects in the first place. And in particular, 6 pathways through which something such as an environmental policy can affect different people in different ways, and leave it to the others to discuss how those distributional effects then should be incorporated into cost-benefit analysis. I may have something to say about that during questions and answers, but that's not the goal of this talk. So the first slide here just points out that a lot of what we've done in environmental economics is all about economic efficiency and trying to measure the cost, measure the benefits, what's the right amount of pollution, and how to achieve it most efficiently. And I think there's not been enough research done yet on how to measure distributional effects for different people, which has got to be crucially important for policymakers' decisions about whether to do this or not. They're concerned not with just with efficiency, but with distributional effects as well. So the framework that I bring to this is from study of public economics, and in particular tax incidence analysis, and where there's a lot of study in public economics about who bears the burden of this tax or the other. And you can see an example with the corporate income tax. Who, is it do consumers pay more? Do shareholders receive less? Do workers receive a lower wage, et cetera? And in fact, a lot of what I'm going to talk about for my own research is sort of based on that model, the Harberger model. It's a general equilibrium model. And a lot of it points out the difference between statutory incidence, who writes the check, and economic incidence, which is who really bears the burden, and where the difference between those is because of changes in behavior and changes in prices. So you don't just pay more for a corporate product. There might be changes in different products in different ways, and there might be changes in factor incomes, and I'm going to talk about those with respect to environmental policy. And the other sort of definitions that are useful to get as a common parlance here is that a proportional burden is one where the economic burden is the same fraction of income for everybody, and it's progressive if the fraction of income is higher for high-income people, and it's regressive if the fraction of income, the burden as a fraction of income is higher for low-income people. By the way, in this case, it may be regressive even if high-income people are bearing a larger absolute burden, but if it's a lower fraction of their income, we would still call it regressive by these definitions, which I think are standard. Going back to Harberger and the incidence of corporate income tax and questions like that, we talk about the uses side and the sources side, where the uses side involves the cost to consumers and how much more they pay for certain products and who buys those products and how much worse off they are because of it. And the sources side refers to the sources of your income, whether you earn wage income or capital income or something else, ownership of different kinds of resources, however they may be defined, and what happens to those incomes. Environmental policy can be interesting and challenging because once you start thinking about it, there's a whole lot of more pathways than just those two. And in fact, I'll try to be a little bit controversial here by overclaiming the idea that all 6 of these pathways can be regressive. That is, to hurt low-income people more proportionally than high-income people. That's not to say it always happens. I'm sure you can think of counterexamples, but this is, I think, something to watch out for very carefully. So, and by the way, it's a reason to design a reform package that's not just an environmental policy, but a package that helps to protect those least fortunate among us from bearing even more burden than the rest of them. So here are the 6 effects as I see them. The first 2 are the same, that I already talked about. And when you think about a lot of environmental policies, they're going to raise the price of electricity and burning fossil fuels, whether it be heating oil or gasoline or something. And these make up a high fraction of low-income budgets. So the burden from a higher price of gasoline or electricity is going to be a higher fraction of low-income budgets, and it's going to be regressive. And a lot of people have measured these effects, and you can do so very thoroughly and very carefully. You can have an input-output matrix. You can see how much each good is used in the production of each other good, and lots of data on consumer expenditure surveys, thousands of households and what they buy. But it's only one of the 6 pathways. And so putting those numbers into your distributional weights and social welfare function is not doing a good job, because people could be affected by this policy in 5 other ways I'm going to talk about, which could exacerbate this or offset it or just completely different. A second of which is through effects of factor prices, changes in wage rates or rate of return or ownership of factors of production, which might include other resources. A third thing that happens in environmental policy that's not so common in the tax incidents that I was talking about earlier is that it might create scarcity rents. And any kind of quantity restraint or constraint would create these scarcity rents. And in particular, the simplest example is a permit system. Because it restricts pollution to a certain limited quantity, those permits have value. And if they are handed out to firms, then it's the same as handing value to firms. Whoever you hand it to is given that value. And there have been estimates that show how firms can make more profits by being handed these permits. And if these firms are owned by stockholders who are in high-income brackets, then it's going to be regressive because you're giving this value to high-income people. The fourth pathway is benefits of environmental protection. So you're doing something to help people. That's kind of the purpose of it. And, well, who are you helping? And, again, my fear is that a lot of these benefits may go to high-income people. It depends on which program we're talking about, and they all differ. But if it's saving endangered species, I would submit that low-income people are, mostly not too worried about that. They're worried about putting food on the table, roof over their heads, feeding their children, and they do not have high willingness to pay for saving endangered species. And we do a program that might well be worth that form of environmental protection, but who is it benefiting? The benefits may be going to high-income people. Reducing global warming is going to reduce sea level rise and prevent losses to the high-income people that happen to own beachfront property. It may not be as yes, where's Richard there somewhere? Sorry, Richard. And costs of transition, which are often ignored by economists. In fact, even the models I was talking about earlier assume, fixed labor and capital that are freely mobile between two sectors and earn the same wage in both sectors. Well, if workers could just that are laid off here could walk across the street and earn the same wage across the street, that'd be fine. But that's what we assume. But it's not exactly true. And the cost of transition may be higher on those low-income people that can at least afford to bear that burden. Or to put it another way, there's a lot of study in economics of capital adjustment costs and how much it costs firms to make all these new investments. Well, even if it does cost firms to make these new investments, it may be a 10% reduction in the value of the firm. That may put some burdens on some high-income people that own those firms. But most people have a balanced portfolio, so the percentage burden on any individual is not that high. The percentage burden of getting laid off and losing all of your income is 100%, and we just don't pay enough attention to that. And finally, capitalization effects. that really result from these first five in many ways. If there's environmental protection, that may raise the land prices or house prices in the area that's now improved environment. These are different in this case. Now, most often in doing cost-benefit analysis, you are trained not to do both. It's double counting to count the value of the cleaner air and the value of the improvement in property. And in fact, you might use the increase in the value of the property to infer what was the value of the clean air. They are the same thing. In this case, they're not exactly the same thing, and it becomes much trickier to do this correctly. There may be, some people that don't own property that are breathing cleaner air. There may be other people who own the property that get the capital gain, sell the house, and then leave. To measure who's better off, you need to know who's getting that capital gain and who else is breathing the air. So the distributional effect is not going to be that easy. Well, I have one diagram here that I might use several times if I have time. It's a very simple supply and demand diagram. The demand reflects declining private or social marginal benefits. There's a lower private marginal cost curve. The externality means there's a higher social marginal cost curve. And all those six effects that I was talking about can be represented here. It's really just a schematic partial equilibrium diagram to represent things that really go on in general equilibrium, but at least I can point to this diagram multiple times. The cost to consumers, the first pathway I was talking about, is really just area A plus D. It's a loss in consumer surplus. It's how much higher price people pay for these commodities. And if you look at, who pays the higher cost of those commodities, you can see, in some consumption data here, the fraction spent on electricity is a declining fraction of income. That's what I mean by regressive. It differs by region. So in this case, the South spends more on electricity, the red bars. The Midwest spends less on electricity. That's just the cost of air conditioning, basically. If we go to natural gas consumption, that's more in the Midwest. But it's still declining as a fraction of income as you go up to higher income levels. Here's fuel oil. This happens to be higher in the Northeast, and these have different carbon intensities. So that these people will be affected differently by a carbon tax in ways that depend on what region they live in and whether they heat using natural gas or electricity or fuel oil. But you can see regional differences and regressive pathway. By the way, I did a talk like this in India, and I've got a research assistant to find some data showing, there's all problems how you measure these things. But again, it's downward sloping bars, both for that rural area and in the urban area. Second pathway is the sources side. So this is how much worse off are the people that produce this stuff. So that's the loss in producer surplus, B and E, on this diagram, and that's less to be paid to factors of production. I'm going to skip these slides. It's really just sort of an advertisement for some general equilibrium papers of mine that look at both the sources side and the uses side. But again, that's only two of the six effects I'm talking about. It's also a little more complicated when they're not taxes at all, but mandates, because there's no tax revenue, the burden of which needs to be distributed, but it affects different people different ways. The third area I was talking about, the who gets the scarcity rents, is the scarcity rents in this diagram is basically area A plus B. You can see there's some double counting in a sense, but different people are affected differently. I mean, A was part of the lost consumer surplus. Well, that's going to the people that received the value of the permits, in large part. And here's some results from a study by Ian Parry that shows basically how high-income people own corporate stock, and so they're made better off by corporations receiving these permits for free, whether they be sulfur dioxide permits or prospective carbon permit policy. The benefits of environmental protection on this same diagram are basically area C, D, and E. It's the reduction in the external cost. That's what we're doing this for. And but then it's going to matter, who benefits from that. And there may be health effects of whatever the environmental policy is. There's a bit of a problem here because when people talk about an equal distribution of health effects, they might mean that people are affected or get health benefits uniformly with some kind of wide distribution of those benefits. But how they value it might differ. And if high-income people have a higher willingness to pay for those health benefits, then once you monetize those health benefits, they're getting most of the benefits. If they have higher willingness to pay and you're handing it to them, then it's worth more to those high-income people than to the low-income people. The cost of transition, here's what we usually ignore. The area F or E and F are resources that used to earn income in this industry that are now laid off and told to go elsewhere. If they can get a job across the street at the same wage, that's no problem. But typically they can't. And so I'm sort of bringing that area back into the analysis. And then, I think I said this already, that we're models of capital adjustment costs, and there's not enough research, I think, on these labor adjustment costs, and it's going to depend on the time frame and how long you're unemployed. Now, this is actually my last slide, but it points to the difficulties of these capitalization effects that I think are particularly difficult, pernicious, capricious, and ironic or something. You might try to make a low-income neighborhood better off by cleaning up their environment. Well, it doesn't work that way, as papers by Carey and others have shown. It might make the people that live there worse off when you clean up their neighborhood. If in particular they are renters, making that area cleaner is going to increase property values, increase their equilibrium rent, drive them out of that neighborhood. They have to go somewhere else. You didn't help them a bit. But here's a different story about a toxic spill discovered seeping into the groundwater. The neighboring homeowners don't like it. They sell their house. They take the loss. They go elsewhere. Others buy it for cheap, and they're living there when the toxic spill seeps into their basement or contaminates their groundwater or whatever it might be, and they're suffering damages because they've got contaminated well water, so they sue. And they might win in court, and they might be compensated for their damages. But my point is they already were compensated for their damages by having bought the house for cheap in the first place. The damage awards are going not to those who lose. The people who lost were the people that sold their house earlier. It's because it's capitalized into the value of the house. And then there's the effects on the firm. They have to pay these damages, but the people that pay the damages are the stockholders at the time of the damage award, not the stockholders who owned the stock at the time that the damage occurred. And besides, the stockholders who owned the firm at the time the damage occurred, they might be responsible in some legal sense, but they were not the ones who benefited from doing the pollution. The ones who benefited from doing the pollution were the consumers that bought that product for cheaper because the cost of the product didn't cover the social cost of production. So how are you going to get it back from the consumers that bought that product for cheaper? And so I think this idea of compensation is just really a lost cause, by the way, in case you're thinking of trying to find those people that used to own the stock at the time they did the damages, and they weren't the people that benefited from doing the pollution in the first place. So I think that's my last slide, and I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're now going to hear from Matt Adler from the University of Pennsylvania.
All right, I'm going to talk about how equity metrics, or the different kinds of equity metrics that might actually be incorporated into regulatory review. So as it currently stands, the executive order that we still have, pending news about its amendment or repeal, that executive order, 1286, actually does, as most of you know, tell agencies to be sensitive to equity. It says, Section 1A says, in choosing among alternative regulatory approaches, agencies should select those approaches that maximize net benefits, and the net benefits are defined to include, among other things, distributive impact and equity. Section 1B5 also talks, if you look at it, about equity. But the executive order doesn't say much more than that, so no much more guidance about what equity means in the executive order itself. And if you look at Circular 84, the guidance document, although that is quite detailed about lots of issues, so for example, about the discount rate, it doesn't provide much guidance either on how agencies should evaluate the equity impacts of regulations. Note that, to begin, the notion of being more rigorous and quantitative and systematic about measuring equity is not a pipe dream. if you look at the scholarly literature, or more precisely literatures, there are a variety of quantitative frameworks for measuring equity, each of which is quite widely employed in some scholarly literature. And those are, and maybe others, but at a minimum, these widely used by scholars frameworks include inequality metrics, and I'll talk in a bit about each of these, poverty metrics, incidence analysis, Donna just talked about that, what I'll call social gradient metrics, social welfare functions, which in turn are closely related to the notion of doing cost-benefit analysis with distributive weights. And then I say C also, quality-based cost-effectiveness analysis with equity weights. I say C also because I'm not aware of a large literature actually using CEA with equity weights, but certainly the notion of using equity weighting for CEA is, as a theoretical matter, quite widely discussed in the health economics and public health literature. Okay, just to very briefly summarize each of these, and I realize I have limited time, and I'll give a reference in a bit that I'll provide for the discussion. Inequality metrics include such familiar metrics, at least to some of those in the room, as the Gini coefficient, the coefficient of variation, the Atkinson index, the Tile index. I mean, these are somewhat different in their axiomatic properties. So, for example, the Gini coefficient is related to the Rentz curve. The coefficient of variation is a statistical measure, which is just a standard deviation divided by the mean. The Atkinson index is related to the Atkinson social welfare function, which we'll talk about in a bit, which Maureen has already mentioned. The Tile index is yet another one. But they all basically do the same thing, right? They're all used to look at the distribution of some item in some whole population. Typically, in the scholarly literature, they've been used to measure the degree of income inequality in a population. So the relevant item is income. They've also been used in a smaller literature to look at the inequality of health. So that's one whole literature. A second literature that uses a kind of equity metric is the literature measuring poverty, widely used or applied to issues of development, also used domestically to some extent. Here the idea is just to look at a population and try to decide how poor it is, right? And more formally that's done by defining some threshold, right? And then coming up with a poverty metric as a function of the percent of the population below the threshold and the distribution of incomes below the threshold. So in effect, this is a kind of inequality metric, but one that is insensitive to above threshold distribution. It just focuses on stuff below the threshold. Like inequality metrics, poverty metrics have traditionally been used to measure income poverty. More recently, inspired by important work by Amartya Sen, a lot of applied work is actually focused on measuring poverty in terms of non-income so-called capabilities, things like health, housing, nourishment, or environmental quality. Incidence analysis, Don has talked about that, but the idea there is to look at whether the, not absolute, but as we said, fractional monetary burden of a policy increases or decreases as individual income increases. If it increases, it's progressive. If it decreases, it's regressive. It's the same. It's proportional. Traditionally used to study tax policies, but as Don suggested, it also can be used and has been used to study non-tax policies such as environmental mandates. Social gradient metrics, that's the term that I'm using. These metrics, again, widely used in different scholarly literatures, look at the skews in something between high status and low status social groups. So, for example, there is this now substantial literature on environmental justice related to EO 12898 that tries to quantify, right, whether some pollution source has a disproportionately high impact on minority or low-income individuals, where being minority or being low-income is a kind of low social status as compared to the general population. And there is a close parallel between these environmental justice metrics and a kind of social gradient metric widely used in the public health literature, health equity metrics, which again look at skews in health across racial or class lines. Social welfare functions, and I'll talk a little more about this, or a lot more depending on time later in the presentation. The basic idea here is to measure individual well-being using a utility function and then to aggregate utilities using a social welfare function. Now, a critical point is that utilitarian social welfare functions are simply one kind of social welfare function. It is quite possible to have non-utilitarian, or what I call equity regarding social welfare functions, which are sensitive to the distribution of well-being. And once more, these are not just a theoretical construct. I mean, there's certainly theoretical literature, again pioneered by Sen and going back earlier to Arrow about SWFs. But as a more applied matter, these are the central tool in the field of optimal tax policy. I mean, Jim Mirrlees won the Nobel Prize for work that got this going in the early 70s, and they're also used to some extent in environmental economics. And I won't have time to talk about this here, but there's a very, very close relation between the notion of social welfare function and the notion of applying distributive weights to cost-benefit analysis. And then finally, this idea of using cost-effectiveness analysis with equity weights. So there, instead of doing straight cost-effectiveness analysis, looking at straight incremental cost-effectiveness ratios, the idea is to apply weights to the quality amounts to reflect the health level of individuals affected by health measures. All right, and again, I give a fuller description. I have an article which will be on the website. I'm happy to know that since it's been more than a year since publication, I now have the copyright to that, and I can put that on the website, which talks about all of these, and a book, I hope 2010 if not optimistic, but in any event, a book that talks generally more systematically about incorporating equity into policy analysis, which is going to be coming out. And in particular, I argue that social welfare functions are the most attractive framework, I think, for quantifying equity. But what I'm proposing, here's a modest proposal. It's actually a genuinely modest proposal as opposed to the ironically modest proposal. This is more agnostic. The proposal here is not to push my favorite baby, which is social welfare functions, but more generically, that the executive order, now it may already be written, so this may be moot, but just add a line, right? Tell agencies that, among other things, right now they're told to quantify cost and benefits, but among other things, they should quantify distributive impact as part of the regulatory analysis, right? And that could then be fleshed out, right? Just as A4 right now fleshes out things like the discount rate, A4 or its replacement could provide more detailed discussions of existing metrics and ideally give guidance in which one to use. And the regulatory analysis should, if it uses one as opposed to another metric, just explain it, right? Give some justification for why it's chosen a particular metric. And if it decides to choose policy A, where policy B is the policy favored by the metric, to give some explanation. The explanation might be the statute requires policy A. The explanation might be equity is better handled through the tax system, right? But at a minimum, agencies should start, buttressed by a directive of the EO, should start quantifying equity impacts using one or another of these metrics as part of regulatory analysis. And if they decide to choose an option not favored by the metric that's employed, to explain that. And indeed, there is I think, a quite strong precedent for this. If you look at the Green Book, which is the UK equivalent of, it's really the combination of 1286 and 84, that actually now recommends, has done this for the last at least 5 years, the use of cost-benefit analysis with distributive weights and gives some discussion about how those weights might be specified. All right, now, there are going to be lots of objections, and we can talk about these in the Q&A, so let me just try to draw this thing a little bit, or at least put on the table how we might talk about the objections. One objection, which one hears a lot, and is certainly important, is that why not simply, qualitatively as opposed to quantitatively characterize equity impact? I mean, that's right now what agencies do. That's right now what A4 and 12866 allows them to do. The response is there are a gazillion different ways to qualify, to characterize the distribution of effective policy. I mean, we talk about distribution across income groups, across health groups, across longevity groups, across age groups, across racial groups. I mean, there's a literature now on happiness. We talk about whether a policy has skewed impacts depending on whether people are more or less happy. The very point of these equity metrics is, not just metrics, they're frameworks, right? They provide systematic, well worked out ways to do the characterization, right? So I think it's, bottom line is we need, given sort of cognitive limitations on the part of the citizenry and decision makers, we can't, characterize distribution all the possible ways. We need to pick one, and the very function of these metrics is to help us do that. Another objection is specifying equity metrics is a value choice. Right, it is. But you know what? So is the choice to use cost-benefit analysis. So is the choice to use cost-effectiveness analysis. Now, it might be said, well, equity metrics, yes, it's a value choice, but it's also a controversial value choice. But using cost-benefit analysis or cost-effectiveness analysis, although it's a kind of value choice, is not controversial. Well, that's also not true. I mean, cost-benefit analysis is not controversial in this room, right? But as Jim Hammett points out, that just means that analysts are sort of a self-selected community of folks who like cost-benefit analysis. If you know Lisa Heinzeling and lots of other people outside this room, you know that cost-benefit is also not just a value choice, but a controversial one. Same is true about cost-effectiveness analysis. And if you're worried about having democratically legitimate structures to support controversial value choices, well, let's note OIRA, the executive order, and executive agencies are actually supported by the democratic legitimacy of the president and also by the fact they're subject to legislative override. A final objection is that equity should be handled through the tax system. It turns out, and Dick Zickhouse has actually written similar work on this, and a lot of work by Lou Kaplan builds on that work, but the supposed optimality of using the tax system to handle equity objections actually depends on certain contingent and maybe empirically false technical assumptions having to do with separability in the utility function. And even if you think that that's not a problem, at a minimum, this is the more basic one, at a minimum, right, we can use equity metrics in policy analysis as an informational tool. That is, we can say, something cost-benefit favors this measure, equity favors this measure, we're going to choose this measure, but tax system come in and correct that. Right? So even if you sort of accept, and again, Kaplan was the one who's done most to pioneer this, the notion that the tax system should be used to handle equity, that's consistent with incorporating quantitative equity metrics within regulatory analysis as a way to inform the tax system about what it should do. Okay, so I'll very briefly go through one or two of these to say something about social welfare functions, which I think are the best way to do this. And again, I give a fuller discussion in the article, which will be on the website, and in the forthcoming book. The nice thing about social welfare functions is that they're sensitive both to well-being, right, as a function of policy impacts across the entire population, and tell us how to balance overall well-being against equity. Right? The other metrics, first of all, often take as their inputs not utility, which is an inclusive measure of well-being, but a subset of the determinants of well-being, such as income or health and so forth. But more fundamentally, I think the problem, with the exception of cost-effectiveness analysis with equity weights, inequality metrics, poverty metrics, incidence analysis, social gradient metrics do not tell us how ultimately to balance overall well-being against equity. What these do is provide some measure of equity. But if at the end of the day we find that equity favors policy B and overall well-being policy A, we need to know how to balance those. All the metrics on the board except SWFs don't tell us how to do that balancing. All right, just very, very quickly. So what social welfare functions do, the basic components are a utility function, which is a way to transform outcomes, however characterized, into lists of utilities representing each person's well-being, and then a social welfare function which takes each such list or vector of utilities and maps that onto a single number representing how good that outcome is as compared to other outcomes. Attractive social welfare functions obey two critical principles: the Pareto principle, right, which again actually is not uncontroversial, but among economists is wholly uncontroversial. But the critical point is that if you care about equity, you're going to be sensitive not just to the Pareto principle, but to the Pagoo-Dalton principle. So I'll stop here. The Pareto principle, these are now utility numbers, right? So 3, 4, 10, 12 represents a population of 4 people, right? So if we have a policy that moves the vector of utilities from 3, 4, 10, 12 to 3, 4, 10, 13, the last person there has moved up from utility 12 to utility 13. The Pareto principle says, 3, 4, 10, 13 is better. That's uncontroversial. The utilitarian social welfare function, among others, will do that. The Pagoo-Dalton principle, which is really the hallmark of equity, says, in addition, if we transfer utility without losing any from someone who is better off to someone who is worse off, that should also improve the outcome. So note in that second row that we've gotten to 3, 6, 8, 12 from 3, 4, 10, 12 by taking 2 units of utility from the third person, transferring that to the second person, right? So 4 goes to 6, 10 goes down to 8. The Pagoo-Dalton principle says 3, 6, 8, 12 is a better outcome than 3, 4, 10, 12. This Atkinsonian family of social welfare functions, which Maureen talked about, which John Levy has used, is how do you get there? That has this, among other things, it has a very nice functional form. It's basically utilitarian with one further parameter, the gamma parameter, right? So it takes the form 1 over 1 minus gamma with some of the utilities to the power 1 minus gamma, right? Gamma can range from 0 to infinity. If gamma is 0, that's utilitarian. If it's infinity, it becomes less than min. And the way you get there axiomatically, which I think is quite powerful, is you take the Pareto principle and the Kudolin principle, which I think are the hallmarks, a combination of the hallmarks of equity, and you add in two other plausible axioms, namely separability and invariance for ratio transformation, and you end up with this. And indeed, if you look at the literature on optimal tax, right, which is the biggest applied literature using social welfare functions, invariably, almost, that's the form, right? So the notion, I'm going to stop now, but the notion of using this tool to think about equity impact of policies in a way that allows us to be sensitive both to overall well-being and equity and balance the two is quite feasible, and it's not more complicated than cost-benefit analysis. To get to this, we need to identify what utilities are. I'll talk about that in the Q&A, and we need to get to a gamma parameter, but it strikes me as being something which is both normatively defensible and quite feasible. However, like any normative proposition, that's not going to be uncontroversial, so I look forward to your questions during Q&A.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Scott Farrow from the University of Maryland at Baltimore County.
Thank you. I think I'm going to be Matt Adler, light and slow. That's what's going to happen. Also, in terms of where I'm coming from, just like UCLA, we sort of don't spell it out. There are parts of that name we don't like, so we just go UMBC, just like UCLA. Anyway, the situation I'm trying to think of, also from my previous time as chief economist at the GAO, is I'm trying to think about there's a team of analysts out there in an agency. They could be in a lot of different agencies. They're trying to look towards the guidance and go on, what the heck do I do? Okay. And so, in some sense, I'm not going to present new ideas. I'm trying to think about if I were tasked with, well, how might I bring equity issues more into OMB guidance? This is sort of the low and slow way that I would try to do it. Oops, snuck a graph in on you already. Since this is, in part, the Society for Risk Analysis, okay, we've got risk aversion. We've got this nice setup over here. We have a concave utility function. We have certainty equivalence. And what happened was, actually, Heavily Atkinson, 1970, they said, we can use exactly this same setup to talk about inequality aversion. So for you Society for Risk Analysis people, when you're talking about risk, rename your variables, and we're talking about inequality. That's almost the end of the talk. But thank you. You wish you were so lucky. Instead, I'm going to talk about the target audience for the guidance, criteria, descriptive, you can also think positive here, distributional analysis, normative, and my recommendation summary. On the target audience, again, it's this group of analysts out in the agency. I think, and I can visualize myself as one of these people. You think about it as an applied economist, an interdisciplinary team, master's students who went through Joe's benefits cost class or mine. You know, what can they actually implement out there? And not only implement, it's in order to be useful to the decision makers. And I think that puts some limitations on things. When I think about criteria for what gets put into guidance, this is a GAO kind of question. You sort of go, well, what do we want to include as guidance? And we might think about going to some economic standard setting authority. There is none. Okay. You might go to the professional literature. It's scattered and huge. Okay. So we often go to textbooks, and that's about where I'm going to be, or different agencies bring in government advisory groups. One little point here in terms of accounting principles, what we look at in terms of textbooks in the literature is the lowest set of acceptable guidance for accounting principles. Sometimes that's fun to keep in mind. I'm not going to read this. This first step is just what about the charge to analysts on equity? And as Matt pointed out, it already exists in A4. It says your regulatory analysis should provide a separate description of distributional effects. And later on, where distributional effects are thought to be important, the effects of regulatory alternatives should be described. It's there. It's already there. So the recommendation 1 is more like a Hahn and Belzer scorecard kind of thing, which is if it's in the guidance, maybe OIRA should consistently implement or enforce that a distributional analysis should exist or be discussed. The gap that Matt referred to, if the medium is the message, sort of count up the words on the guidance in A4 and go, well, where's all the emphasis? Once you get past that paragraph in the previous slide, there's really nothing else for guidance on distribution. So the rest of the part I'm going to fill in is I think there should be 2 sections on guidance. One is sort of descriptive, ways we might analyze incidents or impacts. And then the second, the link to the normative or subjective aspects. So the standard textbook descriptions have decompositions, consumer, producer, surplus, government, externalities. Don gave us some other decompositions. And there are also inequality descriptive statistics that, and this is, you think about OMB as integrating things across agencies, Census has advisory groups and are regularly putting out a variety of descriptive statistics about inequality in the economy. And here I picked out several. These are more detail than you want to know, but basically current 2007, think about this money income, shares of aggregate income by percentile. Now you're looking at a Lorentz curve here if you aggregate these. And summary measures down here. Census Bureau has fought some of these battles. Down here we've got Gini index, deviation tile, and these mysterious Atkinson indexes we've been talking about. The U.S. government puts these out regularly as measures of inequality. Just a reminder, so take some of those numbers, you get a Lorentz curve. Part of what I think OMB should be doing is fleshing out the medium as a message, as Matt was saying, in part that, mention some of these in some detail, provide a bit of guidance. Gini coefficient being relative areas, A over A plus B. Now we're back to this Atkinson measure, again sort of looking like risk aversion. And what we're looking at here, this is, might be down here a little low, what the Atkinson measure is, think about your risk aversion setup. If this is your certainty equivalent, which gives you the same utility as the expected utility of the gamble. So that CE is the certainty equivalent and Z is the amount you would be willing to pay to avoid the gamble. In that same sense, if people have inequality aversion, they needn't, If the utility function is a straight line, you have no income inequality aversion. You don't care about it. But the Atkinson index says, well, what's essentially the willingness to pay to have a certain mean income? How much are you willing to give up in order to have an equally distributed income? If you have a heavily bowed curve, you're willing to give up a lot for an equal income. If it's straight line, you're not willing to give up any. Those are so far census data we're talking about. And I'm just saying, maybe OMB should talk with the rest of the government that's using these measures and see what they might produce. So that's what I call the descriptive or positive start. And analyzing your project takes time and effort. You should try to positively report how you think your project is going to affect different groups, and there are different measures to do so. OMB could provide some guidance. Now we go to the second more difficult part on the normative aspects. And, Don nearly killed me with his bottom line on forget compensation, but I'll go there anyway. If we think about sort of rejecting the Calder-Hicks criteria, which was, I did publish this 10 years ago on compensation rejecting Calder-Hicks criteria. I think that there have been hints that we're worried about specific subgroups, either through executive orders or legislation, and we might investigate, and this ties into Stu's comments on, well, a lot of the separate executive orders might be handled through distributional impacts. And my suggestion is ultimately going to be that, well, OMB should get the lawyers together and go, okay, identify those subgroups, and let's give guidance on what a list is we might want to look at. What motivated me to write a paper on actual compensation to identified subgroups, I did a benefit cost analysis for a petroleum development in Africa for the 2 countries getting loans from the World Bank. It's pretty apparent that sort of the rural subsistence farmers were going to bear a lot of the costs, and other people in the economy were going to get the benefits. With our standard assumptions, no brainer. Actually, it's carefully, results hidden down here. Within the country, you'd have $1.3 billion in positive net benefits. I created a separate table on sort of minimum compensation for some of these groups down here, and it was fairly trivial in this case. $2 million would compensate these identified subgroups, leaving, and it's hiding behind there, leaving about $1.25 billion for other purposes. It's some way to just sort of point out, well, what's the minimum level of compensation for some identified subgroups? And I also broke it down in terms of farm and non-farm, some different things there. So I think you can identify or at least ask criteria or something in the executive order legislation that could drive you to compensate identified groups. The last one, which is sort of where partially where Matt might have been going on distributional weights. One way you can get to the Atkinson index is think about a marginal utility of income just raised to this inequality aversion parameter, E. That is, here we've got a ratio of the marginal utility at income I. Here this is the mean. Just take the top part. This is income raised to a power minus E, where minus E is the inequality aversion parameter. And right now, what we call efficiency in benefit cost analysis is assuming equal marginal utility of income across all individuals. What does OMB tell us to do? It tells us to do sensitivity analysis on key assumptions. My point here is that we currently have minus E equal to 0. Okay, so we have equal marginal utilities. The Census Bureau has selected values, actually less than England, so we accept more inequality than England, has given us values for E, and my suggestion to analysts would be use as default the distributional assumption of OMB equal to 0, use as sensitivity tests the distributional assumptions that the Census Bureau publishes. And the end result here, and I'm down to my last minute here, here we're looking at quintiles of the population, household income. The default, here's our benefit cost assumption. Okay, equal weights across all quintiles. Here's Census Bureau 0.25. You get about a 2-to-1 ratio of weights from the lowest to the highest. You can sort of track this out so your ratios get higher and higher. This is England's sort of suggested illustration over here. So I end up with these normative suggestions, which really, to my mind, boil down to following OMB's suggestion of investigate the sensitivity analysis of key assumptions and use Census Bureau data to generate weights, and to have lawyers get together and look across the EOs and statutes to see if there are specified subgroups, and agencies might investigate compensation to those specified subgroups. So let me stop there, slow and basic, for what I think might be implementable. Thank you.
Thanks. And our final presenter will be Wilhelmine Miller from George Washington University.
Thank you. So I really appreciate the rich comments and material that my fellow panelists have presented, because it will help with giving some context to some of my more abstract thoughts. To sort through the many possibilities for addressing equity in regulatory analysis, I'll begin with two premises. First, the primary tasks of the regulatory analyst and decision maker are to present and choose among alternative strategies for reducing risks and harms, and to improve societal well-being with respect to a certain set of activities, such as food production and processing, or a specific domain, such as air quality. Second, societal well-being includes considerations of equity or fairness, as well as economic utility, as described by the non-utilitarian social welfare function that Matt Adler just presented. So taken together, these two premises imply that some inequalities are of the first importance for regulatory analysis and decision-making, and others are of lesser relevance in the particular regulatory context. Asking whose injustice I take to mean who owns the problem as well as who suffers unfairly. So in my remarks, I'll touch upon the following: fair processes and fair outcomes, and the necessity of addressing both in risk regulation, identifying the most salient distributional consequences in the context of a particular regulatory analysis and intervention, assigning responsibility for rectifying identified and remediable unequal burdens and benefits of regulation, and addressing distributive impacts of risk regulation in tandem with quantified BCA or CEA in a narrative fashion that includes public discourse of some kind. And finally, creating opportunities for public engagement about harms and risks that can be mitigated by regulatory action, with attention to how the costs and benefits will be shared across society and within particular communities. So looking at the various executive directives requiring distributional analysis and attention to environmental justice raises the question of what we expect a distributional analysis to accomplish. And I think, as Scott pointed out, I have taken this from the perspective of the regulatory analyst and decision maker in the agency, and asking what their role in this process is. Is it merely to raise awareness of distributional impacts and injustices, to elicit debate and engage new participants in the regulatory process, or to achieve greater social equity, and if so, within what domains in the context of the rulemaking? Is the analysis the last word on distributive impacts, or the beginning of a conversation ongoing about policy alternatives and solutions? So is its purpose, therefore, to trouble spot, to be followed up with further focused investigations of adverse impacts and targeted interventions at a local level? In a distributive or equity analysis, you'll only discover the disparities in impact that you anticipate in the first place. Thus, selecting the population subgroups for comparative analysis of impacts signals what the regulator considers to be relevant for justice. It anticipates some kind of unfair disproportionality in benefits or burdens. So fair process and regulation includes but isn't limited to the ways in which citizens and social groups are considered and engaged in the development of policies. Here I'm going to focus on the public engagement aspects of fair process, and the usual range of modes of public engagement include the ubiquitous notice and comment in the promulgation of regulation, public hearings, and also less frequently used and more costly mechanisms such as participatory workshops, citizen advisory committees, and citizen juries, such as the Citizens' Council that advises the UK's National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, or NICE, on their inclusion and coverage of particular medical technologies. The downside of the more ambitious forms of public engagement and regulation is real. Public engagement is time-consuming and expensive. It can raise expectations for consideration in the outcome of the deliberative process without delivering, and it is subject to capture by powerful interest groups simply because of the investment of time, money, and expertise that participation requires. At the same time, however, mechanisms for public involvement can give voice and recognition to underrepresented groups. It can raise awareness of both the need and the potential for remediation, even if this remediation is better achieved by another mechanism, such as through the tax system or income support policies. And it can also surface new solutions and remedies for inequitable impacts because diverse and local perspectives can be brought to the table. Procedural fairness is important not only because we might not be able to agree upon what the fair or just outcome is, which is the typical argument given by philosophers for procedural justice, but in the regulatory context, as Don Fullerton pointed out, we know that we won't be able to resolve all distributive issues in the end. Compensation isn't always possible. In this case, giving voice, raising awareness of what to look out for in terms of inequitable impacts, whether localized with respect to a dispersed disadvantaged group, may be the most that can be accomplished within the regulatory context. Recognition or formal acknowledgement of the political and social standing of members of society, both as individuals and as belonging to socially and geographically distinct groups, is an important end of procedural justice and of paying attention to distributive consequences. Engaging the public may be most effective at the local level if the impacts are largely site-specific and consequently may have a better chance of identifying and remediating excessive risks and burdens than intensive engagement at a national level. So what questions should we ask about what makes a regulatory intervention fair or just? First, is the regulatory agency ethically obligated to address all disparities in benefits and burdens? I would argue that it is not, and in any case, the regulatory agency will be unable to fully characterize, let alone address, all disparities. Next, we should ask what characteristics of unequal outcomes are salient in the context of the regulatory action. And third, are some inequities revealed by the regulatory analysis better suited to solutions outside the scope of the regulation? So let's look at a specific case. And I'll pick up here on the incidence analysis that Don presented. Identifying the population subgroups for which an equity analysis should be conducted is the first step in homing in on those disparities and outcomes that the regulatory process should be expected to address. In the case of fossil fuel emission standards or abatement requirements, for example, relevant groups include those who are sensitive to the specific health risks entailed, children, elderly persons, persons with lung or cardiovascular disease, those who are geographically isolated and thus subject to concentrated exposure perhaps, lower income classes who experience differential incidence of both benefits and costs, socially disadvantaged groups including racial and ethnic minorities, and those who are at heightened risk in multiple ways among those listed above. And each of these groups then merits being part of a distributive analysis in the case in question here. So next, we have to make judgments about the extent to which the regulatory analysis agency or intervention is the proper vehicle for addressing a given disparate impact. For example, is the regressivity of the price effect and employment impact of pollution abatement on a par in terms of our regulatory concerns with the disproportionate burdens or benefits in the intervention's health consequences? If it is not, there may not be reason for quantifying the comprehensive distributive impacts through equity weighting of impacts on different income classes. Regardless of whether or not it is still important to document the distributive impacts of the economic fallout of the regulations, even if they extend beyond the capacity of the regulatory agency to address them. So just because the regulatory agency cannot redress some disparities in impact, it can still call attention to inequities that are likely to be outside of its purview. Referring back to the list of groups for which equity analysis should be considered in the case of emission standards, I'd only note that, in fact, membership in the relevant subgroups, children, chronically ill, geographically exposed, lower income classes, racial and ethnic minorities, overlap to a substantial extent, and that those at heightened risk in multiple respects demand special attention and possibly distinctive avenues of redress. Concentrated, persistent disadvantage may require redress through both broader and more focused strategies, tax or income policy on the one end and local participatory decision-making on the other, as well as in the regulatory decision-making itself, if, in fact, one regulatory approach can be expected to reduce disparities more than others. So my perspective on equity weighting comes primarily from considering equity adjustments for quality-adjusted life year valuation in CEA for healthcare resource allocation decisions. Scott Farrow and Matt Adler have made compelling cases to present what-if scenarios based on different levels of inequality aversion and to work with an equity regarding social welfare function. These proposals deserve serious consideration. Still, I'm concerned that equity weighting within a benefit-cost analysis reduces the comprehensibility of the calculation and will invite suspicion or skepticism by decision makers and interested parties about what else has been brought into the quantified analysis. Quantifying information makes it more abstract. The components of a quantified analysis are subsumed and in some way disappear in the total. If we don't believe that quantified results should serve as a bottom line, a yes or no indicator in adopting a policy, we don't need to choose to load all factors into it. It's better to keep the quantified analysis simply one part of rather than something that reflects the totality of our considerations. If we do not incorporate distributive impacts as part of BCA or CEA, the quantified analysis cannot be mistaken for the last word. It remains an additional piece of information in the deliberative process. So last, we should give careful thought to when and where public deliberation is most effective. The ideal of empowered participatory governance, concrete, specific solutions developed in an inclusive deliberative process, may not be realistic in the context of federal rulemaking. If it isn't, that doesn't mean it's not an important objective and avenue to pursue elsewhere. Federal rulemaking can highlight the need and offer tools with which local jurisdictions can involve directly affected and socially disadvantaged constituencies in decision-making. Implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of risk abatement interventions offer important opportunities for considering and involving disadvantaged and excluded groups in rectifying historical and persisting inequities. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll have all of the speakers come to the front of the room, and we'll start a queue at the middle door for questions, please. Oh, yes. Is this yours, Stuart? Oh, that's Maureen. And just state your name and affiliation, please.
Brian Humble with US EPA, Office of Air. And what I wanted to challenge a little bit is this concept that and in fact this goes back to Maureen's presentation as well, the concept that somehow we should not be trying to merge efficiency and equity discussions. And the premise here is that, in fact, there may actually be a legitimate willingness to pay, and Scott kind of identified it in his diagrams, but there may be a legitimate willingness to pay for improvements in equity. And the difference in the particular context we're dealing with regulations is that there isn't an exclusivity that you can have with the willingness to pay you're providing for public risk reduction. And so in its very nature, in addition to getting the reduction in risk for yourself, you are getting a distribution of risk reduction, and as such, there's maybe a legitimate willingness to pay component for that. How that's incorporated into our overall cost-benefit analysis, I think, deserves some discussion. But I think it is quite possible to come up with willingness to pay methods to be able to get willingness to pay from either stated preference studies or potentially even from revealed preference studies, where we can try to capture that component of willingness to pay for a distributional shift. And it doesn't have to be scale neutral. You can provide people with, here is the overall change in well-being as well as the distribution. And I think we should be considering whether that's a legitimate component.
I think it may already be in there. If you ask someone, what they're willing to pay for some kind of public program, they might be willing to pay more if they like the equity consequences of it, or less if they don't like the equity consequences of it. And so I don't know how to take that out and in order to separate them.
The question is, should we be explicit, transparent?
Well, we can't be, is my answer, is because it's already implicitly in their answer. We can't separate it out.
Well, I guess I'm saying that a conjoint type, say you're providing a conjoint kind of layout of here's policy parameters, and you can explicitly, and Trudy Cameron has done this in one of her studies of looking at climate policy. So the question is, should we be trying more transparently to lay that out in our willingness to pay scenarios that we provide?
Right. I mean, I wouldn't do it that way. And again, it's a complicated normative discussion. There are really two things going on here. One is the question which, folks in the earlier panel talked about the connection between preferences and well-being, right? Now, I actually think that there's some preferences, namely self-interested preferences, that affect the individual's well-being, but there are other preferences, namely disinterested preferences, that don't affect the individual's well-being. So, for example, I might have a preference about what happens on the planet Mars in the year 3000. Now, whether or not that happens long after my death doesn't affect my well-being, I would say. It's a preference. It can be satisfied. But that's a whole conversation. In particular, I'd say a subset of disinterested preferences. I mean, Dick's shaking his head because he disagrees. But I would say, and this is, we would need to have a whole conversation about well-being. I would say, among other things, purely moral preferences, right, are disinterested as opposed to self-interested. Namely, satisfying them doesn't affect the well-being of the people involved. Now, that's a whole conversation. If that's right, then the question becomes, why are we using willingness to pay measures to quantify people's moral preferences in favor of equity? There are two possibilities. One is because we're trying to capture the well-being effect. But what I've just said is, on my view of things, there are a subset of preferences, namely disinterested preferences, that aren't well-being affected. The other possibility goes back to the conversation about democratic legitimacy, right? We're all concerned about having, given that normative positions and normative techniques are controversial, it would be a good thing for them to be democratically validated in some way. And there are different ways to do that, right? One way is via the president. Another way is via the sorts of citizen juries and so forth that Wilhelmine was talking about. Another way is via your technique. Now, I actually think that there, insofar as one is concerned about reaching normatively attractive results that are democratically validated in a good way, that aggregating willingness to pay measures for people's moral preferences is not the best way to do it. But again, that's a longer conversation.
I'll get my 2 cents in here also. I'm going to distinguish between, I think, a very useful research agenda, which I think your notion and Dick Zerbe's published on this and others. I think there's an interesting research agenda to try to tease out people's preferences there. And some of these things used to be in the micro texts. Henderson and Kwon, you go back and they've sort of dropped out of some of the texts. I'm almost more shorter term saying that what we are currently calling an efficiency analysis has an important embedded equity assumption. And I'm saying we have some basis right now to lay out some of the sensitivity of our results, and that's sort of a useful first step right now.
Kerry Smith from Arizona State and Resources for the Future. I have 3 short points. The first relates to Scott's commentary and others, which is when we're measuring equity effects associated with a benefit-cost analysis, it's an equity effect for a change. So that it's important that we think about the baseline, and it may well be, I think Don's comments emphasized the equity effects. Where do we start from in judging those equity effects, and where do we end when we think about that? And that is much harder, perhaps, or arguably harder than it is in the context of an efficiency judgment. The second thing is the enthusiasm for the Atkinson Index should be tempered, I would argue. The key coefficient in the Atkinson Index happens to be something that many people have tried to measure, and the range is from 0.2 to 10 or 12. Now, everything changes based on where you put it in that range, and this is a source of debate in the macro literature and in lots of other literatures. It happens to be the coefficient of relative risk aversion, and the 12 measures come out of financial judgments, and the measures below 1 come out of labor supply measures. So there's a lot of diversity. The third point is that when we're toting up equity, I remember when this was first raised many years ago in discussing regulatory impact analyses, the context that it was first raised was equity with respect to BTG units, boiler turbine generator units. If you have a regulation, it should be fair across the sources of the pollution. No one mentioned that, but it's something we might want to think about.
Let me just, great point. I mean, again, I didn't have time to talk about this, but I have a very inclusive measure of the currency with respect to which we should be measuring equity. That is the currency with respect to which we should be applying the Atkinsonian measure, and that currency is lifetime well-being. Right? I mean, I think it's crazy to focus on equalizing, exposures to a particular source, and for that matter, income in a particular year. I would be quite inclusive, and I think Don is in other contexts does wonderful work about thinking about equity impacts in lifetime as opposed to sub-lifetime terms. With respect to the first point, again, this is a longer conversation, but I tend to think of taking account of baselines this way. I mean, we have a set of choices, including the status quo. There's no priority we should give to the status quo. Each policy choice can be thought of as a probability distribution across outcomes, right? Each outcome can be converted into a vector of lifetime utility numbers using utility function, right? And for each outcome, we can then apply the measure. It can be a social welfare function. It can be an equality measure. And we can then take the expectation of the measure, and we can compare policies by comparing the expectations. And I'm not sure it's more complicated than doing cost-benefit. On the value of gamma, I mean, here I come back to something that Maureen said. Yeah, there's a lot of work in macroeconomics trying to measure gamma, but it's all revealed preference stuff. So, for example, the whole literature on the equity puzzle, right? Why are SNAP values much higher than debt values? Try to infer, among other things, coefficients for risk aversion or inequity aversion from behavior, but that behavior may be irrational. The better way, I think, to get at the value of gamma, which is an important value, as you say, is to do a stated preference study where you ask people to put on their social planner hats and say, as an impartial matter, to what extent are we willing to sacrifice total overall lifetime well-being for some degree of equalization? Right? There are only 2 studies, and I cite these in my paper, that have actually tried to do that. And the most recent is a wonderful big study that Paul Dolan and co-authors did in Britain. But there's the stated preference literature looking at citizens' impartial judgments, right, with respect to different outcomes to calibrate gamma is very, very small. And I think we should do much more work in that vein, just as we've done a lot of work, right, trying to calibrate utilities as a function of health in the quality literature. And, after doing all that, if it turns out that the range of gamma is from, 0 to 10 or 0 to 100, we can say it's hopeless. But something, maybe that range becomes 0 to 1, in which case this becomes a much more doable enterprise.
Okay. Just briefly here on, I remember Marty Weitzman's chart of what economists thought the discount rate was. Okay. Went from minus something to 15, something like that, for the global climate problem. And here OMB has opined on a discount rate and given a few alternatives. In the similar sense, I think there's a clear default for inequality aversion of 0, which is the current standard, and that we have official government statistics that for years have been reporting alternatives at a couple of points. And I think that gives you a point of departure and good research for the rest of us.
Carrie, if you would temper the enthusiasm for Atkinson measures, then that should temper everyone's enthusiasm for using cost-benefit analysis at all, because the cost-benefit analysis as typically done is a particular Atkinson measure, and there's no call for using any one as opposed to any other. I would think, by the way, that the idea of measuring the proper gamma is absolutely hopeless, because there is no proper gamma. There is no single estimate of gamma for this society. Everybody has their own. And it just pushes back the the level of fairness in the discussion. You want to take into account fairness, so you want a gamma of 2, and I want to take fairness into consideration and have a gamma of 0.5, and if the decision goes with your gamma of 2, then I'm being treated unfairly because I think it ought to be 0.5. There is no gamma that can be estimated. We're going to have disagreements, and of course that's what the democratic process is for. All that one can do is show what would be the implications of a variety of different gammas, and then let people choose for themselves, and let the policymaker or legislator or president choose for himself which he likes, and because he's the one that he or she is the one that has to make the decision.
Yeah. I absolutely agree that the current cost-benefit analysis framework is normative, and there's no sense in which it's privileged or should take priority over any other ways in which you might weight or quantify an inequality aversion or the incidence of benefits. But at the same time, I think we're kind of getting a little bit too wrapped up in what we think matters to people. It's not only regulatory analysts that are having these debates and arguments about what is the right thing to do, and by disembodying the people at greater risk, accepting the larger burdens of a regulation, I think we are perhaps rendering them more invisible rather than representing them more powerfully in the analysis. So again, I would say keep this narrative and discursive rather than, although I do like Scott's idea of a sensitivity analysis to just sort of, show what it would be like if. I only think this is going to matter to a very small number of the audience for this work.
Let me just say one final, just reacting to Don's point about whether or not there's a right answer to gamma. I mean, that suggests, ultimately, to really think about it, it seems to me you need to think about stuff that actually philosophers think a lot about but economists tend not to, which is metaethics. I mean, the foundation of normative claims, right? So, I mean, in a way your suggestion is there's just no right answer because there's no, well, one possibility is there's no right answer because there's no right answer to any normative claim. So it's true there's no right answer to the value of gamma, but there's no right answer also then on that view to whether it's right or not to torture babies, right? So maybe that's right. Maybe there really is no right answer to, number one, what the value of gamma is, and number two, whether it's right to torture babies. I think there's actually a right answer to whether or not it's right to torture babies. And because of that, I also think it's possible there's a right answer to whether or not, to what the value of gamma is. And then, my view, again, this is a long conversation, but I think outside this room and outside of economics, people do talk about there being right or wrong normative answers, and you can make sense of that by talking about what people with full information and full rationality would converge in preferring. And then you can say people with full information and rationality would converge in preferring not to torture babies. And if that's true, and if that's what makes not torturing babies right, you can also look to what people with full information and rationality would converge in with respect to gamma. And so there is a right answer. It's not transparent, but the very point on this view of doing stated preference studies is to put people in the informational conditions such that their answers are better estimates of what we or our ideal selves would converge in answering that question.
Matt, have you stopped beating your wife?
Let's move on to another question.
That's kind of hard to follow. Lou Pearlman, I had a couple of thoughts, probably in resonance with Wilhelmina's observations, but were provoked by Scott's comments, which raised a large question to me of whether the ultimate purpose of this exercise is to manage indicators or to manage behavior. And related to that, you had two particular comments that raised that in my mind. First, your early portrayal of the two graphs saying that aversion to risk and aversion to inequality seem mathematically to look very basically the same. I don't know if you had it in mind, but there's abundant sociological evidence that a high degree of certain types of inequality tend to be correlated with tangible, real risk of war, violence, social revolution, and so forth. So from a political point of view, it's not just a mathematical coincidence. There's something at stake that people worry about. Related to that, your other comment was mathematically, or the data indicated that the British prefer a higher degree of income inequality than we seem to, which immediately triggered in my mind the recollection that the young men who attacked the London public transit system several years ago, young Muslim men, was found afterwards, all seemed to have nice, comfortable middle-class existences, jobs. One was a teacher. They seemed to have been assimilated into the mainstream of British society. So by those sorts of tangible indicators, had achieved some degree of equality. But other survey data indicated that whereas Muslims in France, 70% feel that they're French first and Muslim second, something like 80% of the Muslims in Britain feel Muslim first and not only don't feel British, but hate the British. So there's a disconnect between the apparent superficial quantitative indicators of something like equity and the emotions of alienation and the intensity of the emotions. Of course, we've been watching this play out recently in the streets of Iranian cities. And again, the kind of quantitative analysis Matt would recommend applied by that government might well show that this recent election satisfied technical criteria of being equitable. But clearly there's a big slice of the population that passionately feels otherwise, and that becomes a practical problem.
Just quickly, I certainly don't know the sociological literature, so I'm glad there's some additional connection. On the higher inequality aversion in the UK, this is actually meant in terms of the measures that the governments are choosing to encourage. I don't know exactly what the inequality aversion is. It's just that the UK, in their example, in their Green Book, used this inequality aversion coefficient of 1, and we, for whatever reasons, are reporting it lower. So it's sort of a governmental statistics choice there.
I mean, the last part of the comment raised a very basic point, which is that anything we recommend in this room may be something that the population doesn't like, right? Take even the Pareto principle, right? The most basic normative principle of economics, right? And then take the view of a lot of the population that wrongdoers deserve to suffer. That when someone does wrong, he or she deserves to be made worse off, even if that doesn't benefit anyone else, right? That's a Pareto violation, right? So the point is, this is a general worry, not just about equity metrics, but about benefit cost, about the Pareto framework, and so forth. The solution is, we're in a democracy, right? I mean, we're not. So ultimately, anything that we recommend here that is adopted in the EO, or for that matter, legislation, can be overruled by legislation. And that's a kind of, I think, very important safety valve, and in a way, that makes this, to the extent one is worried about the things you're talking about, which I think are worrying, that's at least a partial response to that.
Yeah.
My name is Richard Feit. I'm with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I'd like to first compliment all the speakers for very good presentations. The one thing has bothered me, that is the tendency of the discussion this morning and also of Executive Order 12866 to focus just on the U.S., almost as if it were a closed society. Of course, it is not. It seems to me there's very important international ramifications of what we've been talking about this morning, that there are equity, and economic, and environmental impacts around the world to our own domestic regulations. And my question is, should we consider those first, and second, can we? The can we relates to the difficulty of getting data about impacts in other countries. It seems to me if the answer is yes, we should consider, we open an enormous can of analytical and political worms here. On the other hand, if we say no, we ignore a lot of very important impacts around the world, and we undermine the whole economic paradigm and intent of WTO.
It sort of relates to my earlier comment about tempering enthusiasm not only for Atkinson measures but for cost-benefit analysis at all. Any such measure, might be useful for sensitivity analysis. Choose different gammas, see what they imply. But ultimately, any single measure of benefits divided by cost is one number, and therefore throws out lots of useful information about what happens to every different person in society to the best you can measure those effects. And that would include people in other countries. So I think the most useful information to provide to a policymaker would be all of those effects. Here's what happens to each different income group. Here's what happens to each different region of the country. Here's what happens to each other country in the world. Here's what happens to endangered species. Here's what happens to the, stockholders, and let them decide. Now, it's a lot of information that's difficult to absorb, and you're looking for a way to unify it. But anytime you take thousands of pieces of information and combine them into one piece of information, you are throwing away information.
Let me pick up on that. And a book edited by Dick Morgenstern, Winston and Lisa Heinzerling, that's just coming out. Part of it is that the economists, we jump to the bottom line too quickly. We get sort of absorbed about, what's the net benefits and all that. And one of the suggestions coming out in that book is more careful attention toward the sequence of presentations. A lot of people want to see the outcomes in their sort of natural units and quantities. And if it's relevant to the problem at hand, some quantities might be internationally based. Other people are concerned about the valuations, 4 separate categories, and finally getting up to the net benefits. So one of the recommendations of that was sort of more equal treatment of the tables leading up to things. And I think ultimately your point there on international issues, though, is one of the first points in a BCA, which is of who has standing. And so, yes, there are decisions to be made early on in the analysis, and you might investigate alternatives, but that's just a fundamental setup or framing question. So.
I agree with that. I mean, it's a fundamental question, and I guess, and it's also a very hard question. I think all these metrics, and it was already been suggested, can be done both ways. Benefit cost can be done with, the relevant population being the U.S. population or the world population, and that's true for all of the equity metrics I suggested, including but not limited to the Atkinsonian. So I guess I would say, my first reaction is do both. Do all the metrics, or do both benefit cost and whatever other metric, whatever equity metric the agency is using both ways. Now, again, there's a concern there about information overload, but that's at least the first way to handle the very important issue that you've raised.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Thank you very much to the panelists for an excellent presentation.